It's a bit of a lengthy one, but I'll try my best just to summarize without leaving any of the important bits out. The viewer here says that I have a lease in a home with two other tenants, and at the end of last year, the two other tenants then adopted a dog. She's not very happy with the dog. She's got some issues. Specifically, the two individuals travel a lot, and on days when they do travel, they let other people to come babysit the dogs, basically. She's not happy with the dog's behavior completely at all. It's just not a good dog. It chews up stuff and it just poos everywhere. And she has to, in some cases, sleep with the door open. And then the lease ends in 3 months. And then a little issue and question is around the fact that she's communicated to them that she's now moving out due to the obvious decisions surrounding the dog, to keep the dog, obviously. And she's happy to pay the 50% of the remaining lease. But since she's moving due to the challenges that they've been facing, it's not fair that she pays the remaining 50% and they must split it between the two of them. So they have fully denied this request and say that the reason for her moving out is completely is not enough, and that she must cover the rest of the lease regardless. Okay, so now the question then boils down to, is the uncomfortable environment an enough reason to move? And when obviously that the lease was signed, there was no mention of pets, and what are her options? Bruno?
So it's quite a long question. There's when Nick and I were discussing it, there's many different aspects to this. So unfortunately, you gave a lot of detail. There's still a lot of detail that we might not have. So first and foremost, one needs to determine what the relationship between the tenant and the landlord is, because I think the biggest risk sits with that relationship. And we don't have enough information over here to make the following determination. But often what we see in practice is you'd either have a landlord that entered into a lease agreement with a group of tenants, like all three tenants or one tenant, but allowing the other two to move in with that specific tenant. So let's say she signed the lease and said, yeah, but there's two other people. Maybe it's my best friend, sister, brother, whatever, right? Now, in that instance, you need to remember that the landlord is not impacted by your specific decision now. All of that now, the relationship between yourself and the other tenants no longer, isn't suitable. It's not the landlord's problem. So we see this very often when it comes to couples. Unmarried couples, married couples, whatever the case is, they take out a lease, they take it out together, and something happens, they break up, and it becomes the landlord's responsibility to sort this out. No, unfortunately not. The landlord then sits relying on whoever signed the lease. And if both people sign the lease, more often than not, the contract would say that they would be jointly and severally liable for the debts of the lease, so both parties would be responsible. So insofar as this question is concerned regarding the specific liability of the remaining period of the lease, unfortunately, if your name is on the lease and you signed it, you will be responsible. Whether you can claim that from the other tenants is a completely different conversation. But insofar as you and your relationship with the landlord is concerned, don't be surprised if the landlord insists on payment from you, because that's more likely than not going to be the case. So that's one example where the lease was signed with you specifically, and you're in the lease. If you're not in the lease and one of them actually signed the lease and you just kind of tagged along, then you've got no direct nexus with the landlord, so you've got no financial responsibility with the landlord, right? So that takes you out of trouble insofar as the landlord is concerned. Last a scenario that could play out is the scenario like student accommodation, for example, where people knowingly enter into lease agreements for shared spaces. So they get a room and then they know that the kitchen is shared or the bathrooms are shared or whatever the case is. So student accommodation is very common with this. But typically, in proper student accommodation, we then start making provision for rules, house rules, that people need to abide by. And failing to abide by these, they would be in breach of the lease agreement. So now we go back to that. So if this is a commune, as an example, or student accommodation, you're well aware that you entered into a lease where certain spaces were going to be shared. Now you need to refer to the specific rules of the accommodation to see what it says about animals and whether having an animal is permitted, how the animals should be dealt with, the closing of doors, security aspects, all of that should be dealt with in the rules. Unfortunately, from the sounds of it, I doubt that there would be rules in place. And this, unfortunately, is the one gray area that I'm going to point out, which is, what then do you do as against the landlord? Can you say that the landlord had an obligation to supply you with the undisturbed use and enjoyment of the property and has now technically failed to do so because the other tenants have somehow infringed this right? And I think that this is an arguable question. So it does depend on the extent of this infringement. So if it was something small like, I don't know, the tenant doesn't leave the bathroom window, doesn't open the bathroom window after going to the toilet, that is not enough, I feel, to say that the landlord did not get free and undisturbed use. But as Nick's example goes, there's an alligator that now lives in the kitchen. That for me is a lot more serious because that actually, it's obviously like the hygiene is gone completely, aside from the safety aspect. So that could be a problem. So now the dog is somewhere, sits in the middle. Having animals is a common, could one expect it? I suppose not. The animal wasn't there at the beginning. So arguably you could say that, sorry, landlord, there was no animal here at the beginning. Now there is. I'm not enjoying the use of the property anymore. Throw the security aspect into it and say that the doors are now left open. That starts getting a lot more serious because now it's a security thing. If the people taking care of the dogs are now partying it up on the property, that's even more. So there is a very good argument to be made that all these accumulating factors put together could actually be brought to the landlord's attention and him being told that he's in breach, and unless he rectifies this. So now you need to follow your lease. If your lease says that you have to give notice to rectify a breach, you will have to send out a notice. You will have to say that he's not giving you enjoyment and use over the property by virtue of the fact that the other lease is now in conflict with yours, and their exercise of their tenant rights in terms of that lease is impacting your exercise in terms of yours, right? So that's definitely an argument. So this deals with the top layer, which is your rights as against the landlord and the landlord's rights as against you. Three typical examples. Each one, apologies. Three typical examples, each one carrying its own, it's like having basically its own outcomes, right? Now the second layer to this is your relationship with the other tenants. Nothing to do with the landlord. Now, if your relationship with other tenants was that the three of you jointly entered into a single lease, then potentially, then it is a conversation over who's liable for what, and they could potentially try and enforce their rights against you to say that it's not material enough. The three of you moved in together, and as far as they were concerned, this was acceptable. You're saying it's not acceptable. We need to look at the nature of that relationship and, again, the extent or seriousness of it. Here, I'd say, again, that you have an arguable case to say that they overstepped what the initial agreement was, and now maybe they're in breach of it. So this common agreement between the three of you definitely needs to be looked at. And then from there, you guys can decide whether you'd continue to be liable in terms of this internal agreement or not. Remember, again, this is completely separate from your relationship to the landlord, because you might agree with the tenants at the end that you don't have to pay a cent. The landlord might not agree to that if your name was in the lease agreement. I think that pretty much covered it. Nick, did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it all.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, it's a clean sweep. So all our questions have been answered. Quite a lot of my follow-up ones as well. So thank you very much, Bruno. And then that does bring us to the end of today's episode. And thank you very much to our viewers. And we'll see you guys again next week.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.